what we want to do is just quickly talk through with Jonathan and Alan some of the stuff that they've been doing with MOOCs. So, Jonathan, just to give us a bit of context with what you've been doing, when did it start, how's it going now?
Okay, so I think it's important to set out at the outset that I don't do a MOOC and never have, and so that's going great. But my background is as a photographer, and it's sort of important to just contextualize everything that I've done. My background isn't as an academic or a teacher, it is as a photographer, and I was a fairly successful one in as much as I was made my living solely by making images and by selling photographs to newspapers and magazines and so on. But over the course of the 15 years that I did that, the business model changed and gradually became fairly broken. And there was a point at which I realized that, in fact, photography was going through a kind of a paradigm shift. And my business model had relied on photographs and paper and a scarce product being sold at a high price. But now I made images. And images are abundant. They can be reproduced at no cost, and and shipped at no cost. And so my business model, it had to change. I mean, I've come to recognize this in retrospect now, but that was a really important moment. Understanding that, in fact, the photograph does one thing: it's fixed in time and it's location specific, whereas the image is abundant and it's distributed. And it can connect you to other people. And so in 2008, a friend of mine asked me to write some classes for a new course, a new university photography course. And I said I would do it, but I couldn't write the same classes that I'd learnt as a student, because they'd been written in the 70s or whatever, and it would be entirely disingenuous, to hold up these famous people that I had photographed that represented a business model that had changed completely, and then to try and sell that. So I said, yeah, I'll write the classes, but it has to address these issues. It has to address the fact that it's unclear as to what a 21st century photographer is when everyone has a camera and the means to publish. What is it that makes a professional different? And so that was the basis for writing the classes. Now, I had to learn how to teach pretty quickly, and I had to learn what to teach pretty quickly. And so it made sense to stick the class on a blog, to ask the big difficult questions publicly, and then seek out answers from whoever had them. I mean, for instance, this idea about rethinking your product, that's what I had to do as a photographer. What was my product when it couldn't be photographs anymore, when I made images now? That was something that the science fiction writer Cory Doctorow helped me to come to an understanding of with when he sort of shared his business model. One of his business models, he was giving away e-versions of his book for free, and still selling hard copy books as well. And he was making a healthy living at this, and he shared that idea of versioning out what we do, rethinking what we do, with me. And I trialed it as a photographer, and it was quite successful. So we unpicked things like that in the classes. That was the beginnings of a class called Picturing the Body, known as PicBod now by its Twitter hashtag, and it was something we went on to develop and explore even further in another class called Photography and Narrative, which is known now by its hashtag, which is Phonar.
Just to summarize, that you took your experiences as a photographer where the business model was about allowing more openness to what you were doing as a photographer, gave you greater reach and greater impact, and to mirror that, yes, in an education setting.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, that was it. So what I did was I realized that the images would connect me to people, using the internet enabled me to use the image to connect to people who I could reach. It was a very discerning way of reaching people who would be most interested in other versions of my product. And so I could use the image to reach out to distributed geeks, let's say, who would then come to me to buy this other version of the product. Let's say the print, for instance. So a super fan of Heath Ledger, would come to me to buy another version of the product. They'd buy the signed print. So yes, that was something that enabled me to do. Now, when coming to teaching, when I put it on the blog, the first thing that people said was, if you give this away for free, then no one's going to buy it. And I had to sort of then say, but this is similar to my photography, my journey as a photographer. In fact, the product isn't the knowledge. You can give that away for free. The product is the learning experience. And what giving away the knowledge does, if you will, is it connects all those people, and you have suddenly this sort of very networked experience with a huge amount of added value and added opportunities for the people who bought the version which is to sit in the room, the premium version. And
so, just when thinking about what you've got a vision of what you want to achieve. In terms of the teaching design, what was your starting point? Was the university VLE ever in the picture, or was it you wanted to start a clean piece of paper from scratch? And how did you get from that to where you are now?
Well, I realized very quickly that any barrier to entry would stop most people engaging. And there are a number of barriers to entry. One was, with regard to the university VLE, one was that you had to pay £27,000 to get access to that. So that narrowed down the class quite quickly and substantially to, whatever it is, 40 17-year-olds or 40 18-year-olds in the room. So, so that really wasn't appropriate. And similarly, every time I considered a space or a different way of teaching or speaking, I have to think, is this going to be a barrier to entry? So it's not using academic language a lot of the time so that anyone can engage with it, not using discipline-specific language so that people could engage with it, using a blog that people didn't have to sign up to engage with. That was important, so that people would sort of drop by and drop in. And of course, there were other reasons as well for using. I was using Blogger at the time. That's the first one I did. So I had no money, had no money at all, no resources, and so everything had to be free. But what this meant, and I've realized this afterwards, one of the strengths was that I had no money. I couldn't afford to build an entirely new network. I had to go to the networks that were already established, and those networks happened to be really well populated. And so it meant, going to Twitter, going to Flickr, going to Vimeo, going to SoundCloud, all those spaces where the fish are already swimming, as it were, and go in there and say who's interested in this class, who's interested in this subject area, rather than having them to change their existing social media behaviors in order to do something entirely different. I mean, I've come to understand now that's largely unsustainable. Don't build a new version of Facebook for the university. Use Facebook. It's really good at being Facebook.
So with these spaces, as a photographer, were you already, present on Flickr, present on Vimeo? Were any of these new spaces for you?
It was all new spaces. I'd never had a blog. I had to learn from scratch. And so if I go back now, and I was quite open about it. I didn't know how to teach, so I needed to learn as quickly as possible. I asked for help. I didn't know how to know what to teach. I didn't, there were no answers. The book's not been written yet on what it is to be a 21st century visual storyteller. So, if you go back to that first, it is one blog post for the entire course. The entire course the entire post just gets longer and longer and longer, with the comments just getting longer and it's acutely embarrassing. But then that's just the nature of learning openly. It is people have been nothing but forgiving to me. Every time I've asked for help, people have come out and helped. No one's ever said, "Well, that's rubbish what you did there." People have always been very generous and always sort of sought to help. You're sitting next to Alan Levine, who continues to help me constantly, and I hope I feed back to him. The point was, no, I'd never blogged, I'd never used any of these spaces before, so I came as a learner. I came as a peer learner, and I learned from my students who were using these spaces, and they could tell me how to navigate them. I mean, that wasn't actually a bad thing in itself.
Yeah, it's probably at this point worth pulling in Alan. So around 2008, 2009, was that when DS106 started?
Actually, it was 2010.
2010, right.
So that was Jim Grimm's creation at University of Mary Washington. I had an interest in this idea of digital storytelling. I went to a conference first on it in the 90s when it was really a film-based thing, popularized very well by the Center for Digital Storytelling. A lot about personal narrative and people learning how to craft a story and then present it in digital form. And so I was always interested because I've long had an interest in the platform of the web as means of expression and publishing. And the idea that a story on the web was innately different from a story in sound or in video because of the affordances of the web to link, to cross media. There's people like Henry Jenkins who've been researching the idea of transmedia storytelling. And Jim Groom took this course at the University of Mary Washington. It is on the books as a computer science class as digital storytelling. It had been taught in a classroom by a teacher with lectures and a book and students doing video. And when Jim took it on in January of 2010, he had this idea of putting the students in the web to do their work, but also with the idea of importance of this notion about students learning to be able to create their own digital space. So they would have to register web domains, not use anything the university provided, and learn not only the things about publishing their work, but also what it took to install WordPress, to manage things, to have control over that digital space. And I was interested, among other people, I followed what they were doing because the students were publishing their work in the open. Jim was publishing his, class in the open, and you could be part of it as an observer, and that was very interesting. And then in October of 2010, someone asked him, and this was in the context of the first, MOOC, the CCK08 that George Siemens and Stephen founded, the idea about having a network that participated in the course. So, we were aware and influenced by that, but the idea of DS-106 in January 2010 being something that people not registered in the course could participate in, they would set up their own blogs and have their content feed into the central course. And the parallels, I think, that are very important and why I got very interested in what Jonathan was doing. Different sort of approaches to platforms, but similar in the idea that the students who paid for the class and had the classroom experience, you weren't trying to replicate that same experience for the open participants. And at the same time, what the open participants did was not the same as the students were doing, but there was somewhat of an overlap. So you benefit by having people from the outside participate, react, communicate, maybe even collaborate with these students, but they definitely had a different experience. And to me, that's what makes what we're doing not really the MOOC-like thing where you're trying to have everybody go through and get this same carbon copy experience.
Something's quite interesting that's kind of a thread between these is the literacies that people are developing as they go along. So Jonathan, you were saying, you were picking this, you were learning as you were going along, and I'd imagine a lot of your students are learning as they're going along. It's a course after all, they should be learning, but they're learning about the kind of digital presence, being online, publishing stuff online. Is that all kind of integrated into the course in terms of support?
In terms of support, it's actually it's kind of fundamental, and it's grown to be fundamental. We've talked about digital photography for years, but we haven't actually thought about what that means. We've always talked about what it does. It means a digital camera, but to actually discuss what the image means, we've never really done that. And so, yes, now the course is much more now about visual literacy and about digital fluency. And so, yes, it's about having something to say, being able to say it very clearly, but then in amongst all the digital noise, it's about being heard. And that's the bit about the sort of digital fluency. So is it supported in a sort of academic sense? Yes, it's now part of the fabric of the course. We have to learn how to use these spaces and how to use and navigate through these spaces, these digital spaces. We also sort of think about what it is to be a sort of digital citizen as well.
I suppose you get this question quite often, how much of an administration overhead is it to run the course in the way you have?
Administration overhead. Okay, so yeah, we should clarify exactly. Me opening up by saying I don't run a MOOC. So mine is a regular class which sits within a closed undergraduate course, photography course. It lasts for 10 weeks, but as Alan described, there is a version of the experience that you can have by joining via the blog, submitting your pictures, listening to the lectures. Crucially, one of the crucial things is tweeting your notes. So if people are listening now and I'm not making sense, if you tweet your questions, if you we haven't established a hashtag, so I guess maybe you can establish a hashtag afterwards, because I'm listening in. I'm listening in now, just as the contributors are to Phonar. After we've recorded a lecture, they listen in very often, and they'll actually respond to the notes and the comments that people put as they listen to the lectures. And so I'll do that now. I'll try and answer questions now if people have them. But I have gone and lost my thread.
But if I could jump in, I mean, Jonathan downplays, his not being an academic, but his intuition is so perfect for this about how people engage, and the idea, the UnMOOC idea that it's not this box that's a course, that is an entire experience, that there's this whole cultural and social framework that builds around it, that means human-to-human connection and the way we interact with each other, which you can't package, you can't plan, you can set up. So like in DS-106, we don't prescribe so much of digital classes and learning ends up, like Jonathan describes, focusing on the tools, and it becomes so minute and uninteresting, and the end product. And students come in with, I refer to it as like an assignment mindset. They need to produce something that's polished, and that's what they chuck in the box. And what we really want to encourage is the people to sort of share their process and share the thinking behind the media things that they create, and create stuff that's bad. So we have sort of the same philosophy about, we don't come off as teachers of this class as being perfect. So we mess up in public, and students see that and they realize, I don't have to be perfect, and I can try something new that doesn't have to be perfect, and it's okay, and then they get the support of the community around them. So that community building thing, and even this idea, this word, we always talk about building communities. You don't really build communities, they happen, and they don't happen accidentally. They happen in some nexus of place, whether it's a cafe or a park, but they don't always happen where you build your nice shiny course MOOC box.
No, and those communities as well have become probably the most valuable aspect of our entire course. Currently there are still only 2 open classes within the degree program, but the most people we've had come to one 10-week iteration is over 35,000. Now that's 35. The compound network opportunities from that many people coming to look at your work and listen to the class with you over 10 weeks is phenomenal. And as you say, Alan, you can build those. You can put the things in place to hope those networks sort of build. But I think one of the most valuable things that people can now draw from some of the stuff that we've done is to adapt or adopt some of the things that we've done, because they can make less mistakes. Don't want people to go away thinking that that's what we do, even though I've sort of described it as learning how to teach and learning what to teach, that it lacks rigor or any sort of sustained academic engagement, because it doesn't. I think it is fairly rigorous, and there is we work really, really hard to make sure that the quality is the very best that we can make it. I mean, I think we should rethink what the product is as an education institution, as educators. I can't see a reason for not teaching this way. It's so valuable. It enriches the learning experience so much. It repositions what we do. And actually, it doesn't actually cost that much at all. It just kind of makes sense. I mean, we're talking about open and connected teaching and learning here. I'm not going to use the word MOOC, because mine isn't distance learning on an industrial scale, which is what I see when I see most MOOCs. I think that actually works out to delouse, I think, if we're going to start that acronym. What I'm saying is that to actually think that the class isn't already connected is a kind of a mistake, because the class is connected. The students are all on Facebook, they're all on Twitter, they're all on all those, so the class is connected. The only person at this point who isn't connected is the teacher. And so where's the sense in that? If the teacher just connects to this network, then they can augment and enrich the experience, not only of learning, but actually of teaching as well. I've learned how to teach, and I'm learning how to teach from people that are really into this, and they're really good teachers. It's accelerated how I've learned to do what I do. I don't know, 100-fold it must be. And so it seems to me that there kind of isn't an option. There isn't an option for photographers anymore. The old business model is broken. The product is very, very different now. If you want to operate as a visual storyteller in the 21st century, then you have to rethink what your skill sets are and what your values are as a supplier. And so I think it's much the same for educators, that we have to rethink what we are, and we're in a great position to do this. The bricks and mortar experience is very expensive to run, but it's marvelous. It's great. It's what students want to go to college for. There is no reason why we can't have this virtual version as well, enriching that on-site experience. It really is a win-win, virtuous circle, whatever you want to describe it as.
I mean, Jonathan's parallel example of his recognition of how his business model for photography is not adaptable to the way science, technology and culture are going. MOOCs get expensive largely because of this reliance on high production video. I mean, that's where those big costs are. That's why they're getting into these hundreds of thousands of dollars. There's a lot being put into these high production videos, and that's not really changing much of the methodology of the teaching. That's one of those transference of what is done inside the classroom to going on the web.
And if you if people are sparking up their Twitter tweet decks or whatever they use, if you do a search on the hashtag Phonar, then the reason I'm not with you today is because I had to teach my Phonar class this morning, and Alan kindly flew over from America just to attend our Phonar class in person.
That is the only reason I am in the UK, Jonathan. You know that.
Right. What's he doing here then?
And so
you got off at the wrong place.
soaking up the sunshine.
And if you do a search on Phonar right now, then you should see the echoes of today's class. So today we will have listened to a lecture, to an interview that I did this morning with an artist called Sarah Davidman, and with the founder of the Pathshala Institute in Bangladesh, which I did last week. He's gone back to Bangladesh, and so you should see echoes of the tweets, the comments, and the discussion there if you sort of scroll through that. I hope so, anyway. But if you tweet now or have been tweeting, then hopefully I'm responding to, and Alan is responding to your comments and questions.